Alrighty, I thought I lost this special nut. The first nut has a pin. See that little pin? Not much to it, but that's what locks the wheel bearing in place. I had left it inside the socket. I couldn't find it, but luckily I got spares. I bought some parts at a flea market a few years ago, a whole bag full of bearings and junk. So there's that pin. Now what happens is you tighten this, you set the wheel bearing torque, which I should check in the shop manual or on the internet, and you put this special washer on, and this washer goes into a groove deep inside there, and it locks the wheel bearing from unscrewing by falling onto that hole. It's kind of tricky to get it in there because you got to use only 2 magnets. That's all it works to get this plate in there, and you got to twiddle whittle the bearing back and forth, unscrew it, screw it until you get it just right so that that locks in place. That's the cotter pin, but they use a little pin. Most of the time I take these apart, that pin is sheared off because people don't realize it's there, and they use it for the outer lock nut. So you put this nut on, you set the wheel bearing tension, maybe it's tightened to get rid of the drag, then you loosen it to the first pin, and that goes into the notch in there somewhere. Oh, right on the top. There's a notch. Here it is right here. There's the notch. That goes at 12 o'clock, right like that. And it locks into the spindle. And then, once you get that seated on that pin, that's on the pin. Then you put the lock nut on, which is somewhere. Oh, right there. The lock nut is identical, except that it doesn't have the pin. And that pin, if you bust it, you can use a drift, roll pin. Anything works, even a nail. I once used a nail, nothing else that I could use. Not the best solution. Then you put on the lock nut, and it squishes down like that, and it doesn't hit the pin because the pin's flush with the top. And you torque that down to 437 million Newton metric meters. You make it tight with this special 4-tooth socket. There's nothing else that works. Gotta buy this socket. This is a chrome vanadium. They sell it everywhere. Chinese stores, Harbor Freight, Jegs, and Amazon. That's how you do that. So I'm going to turn the camera off because I don't want you to watch me or hear me cursing while I try to do this. I'm going to put the nut on with a little pin. That's very important, that pin. That's all that locks it on. This one can't unscrew because the wheel's turning this way, so it's tightening. But if you screw up the other one, you mess it up. When the wheel turns, it unscrews it, and it will come unscrewed. Ask me how I know. I'm going to get to work with my 2 magnets right there. Gotta have 2 little magnets. More junk to buy. I went to the internet to see how tight to make the inner nut. Tighten to 50 foot-pounds and back off a 1/4 turn, then if it's loose, tighten it by hand. So I just tightened it by hand. After I tightened it to 50 foot-pounds, which is fairly tight, I just backed off a 1/4 turn, then it was loose, as in play, which is what they specify on rear-wheel drive cars with the old-fashioned front wheel bearings. So I just tightened it till it was snug, and then I looked to see where the pin was. It happened to be at 3:30 or 4 o'clock, and I put on this disc that locks everything in place, and I've got a spare one right there. And it's kind of hard to tell where the pin is. Best to clean that off thoroughly, then you can see where the pin pokes through. If it doesn't line up, just flip the disc over and your chances are pretty good that you get to see that you've got the pin locked into that special nut. Now I'm going to have to remove, where am I going to put this? I'm going to have to remove those magnets and leave the disc in there, so I use my trusty penknife. There. So I'm engaged with the groove on the top at 12 o'clock. And I'm not going to use the nut with a pin in it. I'm going to keep that. That's the inner one that preloads the bearing. Take my greasy socket lock nut onto the tool. It's indexed. Not sure why, it doesn't really make a difference. There. Here it is. I'm gonna slap, I think I have it on macro. I'm gonna hold the socket because otherwise it flops off and you gotta re-index it. Tighten this preload assembly with the lock nut. And the whole thing takes 500 foot-pounds, which is tight. Some guy said 50, but 50 is not tight enough. I think someone recommended 200 foot-pounds. I think I have this on macro. Alrighty, I've got my giant ratchet, not that giant. Put it on to tighten and crank this baby down. I think it's better to do it with an impact gun, especially since I'm in the way. Yeah, you can't hold the socket in place, so I'm going to crank up the air compressor. I can't use my big one now because my air lines blew apart. Someone busted off one of the fittings. The glue is failing. That joint there is open. It's a mess. What a waste of time that was. Alrighty. I'm going to tighten that baby up. Button this up, and I got the tie rod to replace the worn one, but it's the wrong one. It's too thick. It said with 410 gear, which is what I have, and my threads are much smaller. So I don't know why it doesn't fit. Anyhow, I'll put this back together. We'll fix her up. Having a good time. Working on this. Boy, do things take long. I got the brakes all back together. Be sure to clean out the landing under the rubber O-ring that the bushing slides in. I couldn't get the bushing in with a new rubber O-ring because there was rust behind it. And I'd put anti-seize in there, but it just gets squished out, so that's a rubber seal. I'm going to torque this baby down now to 500 pounds. It says 200 foot-pounds, 120 to 200. So since this is the right side, it's not as critical because it tightens as you drive. The other side should have a reverse thread, really, so it can never come undone. Come on, index onto the torque down nut. It doesn't use a cotter pin because there's no room to put a cotter pin on, so it uses two nuts with a steel retaining washer with a hole in it. Crank that baby down. There, that's 200 foot-pounds, or 250 or 500. Hello. It's getting dark. 8 o'clock. Time to put out your cigarette. You know this little gizmo. How long have I had it for? 1994? 20 years?
No smoking.
Can you believe it? 20 years?
No smoking.
Hot, cold, winter, summer?
No smoking.
20 years. Sitting there. 20 years. Probably more. Probably 22 or 23 because I probably got it in 92. Anyhow, everything's back together. I didn't show it to you because it's getting dark. I didn't turn the light on because I don't have a light bulb. I took it out because I was taking my aluminum bender down. And everything's back together. Two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive. Alrighty, I gotta put the wheel back on and bleed the brakes maybe a touch. And put all my bearings away. Put the tire on. We'll get her done and get that sub done. Yeah, I wish. Just sitting there. Just needs to be assembled. It's the motor from that crew cab I had, that dually crew cab. Just needs all the little goodies put back on. Lots of little goodies. Lots of little parts. Too many parts. Junk.